April 24, 1915, near Saint-Julien, Ypres salient, Belgium. A German junior officer sat in a shallow dugout scraped into the side of a ruined field. The timber supports were still damp. The air still carried the sharp chemical sting that burned the back of the throat. Hours after the gas had passed, he wrote by the light of a shaded lantern, careful not to let the glow rise above the parapet. His hand was unsteady. In his field notebook, he tried to explain what he had just seen. Not the gas, not the dead. Those things, terrible as they were, made sense. What did not make sense was this. "We expected to find abandoned trenches," he wrote. "Instead, the men in khaki were still there." Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of the salient, sporadic rifle fire, distant artillery, the occasional flare hissing upward before hanging motionless over no man's land. The wind that had carried the chlorine earlier in the evening now drifted lazily, uncertain, as if even it had lost its purpose. The German plan had been simple, brutal, but simple. Release the gas, let it roll forward. Let it do what shells and bullets had failed to do for months. The enemy line would collapse. Men would choke, survivors would flee. The trenches would be empty. Then the infantry would walk forward and take what was left. That was how it was supposed to go. But as the gas thinned and the German advance elements moved up, something was wrong. British rifles were still firing, not wildly, not in panic. Measured shots, controlled bursts. Men who should have been dead or running were still holding their ground. The officer paused his writing and listened. Somewhere ahead, a machine gun opened up for a few seconds, then stopped. Short bursts, ammunition conserved, fire discipline intact. This was not the sound of a broken army. He continued writing. They wore cloth over their faces, he noted. Some were coughing, but they did not leave their positions. These were not elite troops. They were not guards units. They were not storm detachments. They were British infantry, regulars and volunteers, men who, according to intelligence reports, were tired, stretched thin, and holding an exposed bulge in the line that should never have existed this long. The Germans had convinced themselves that once the gas was released, resistance would end. Instead, resistance had hardened. Across the salient, other German officers were writing similar things in their own notebooks, on scraps of paper, on the backs of maps. The language was changing. Earlier reports spoke of Ermüdung, fatigue, of an enemy worn down by months of trench warfare. Now new words appeared. Zäh, stubborn, unnachgiebig, unyielding. One battalion commander wrote that his men had advanced expecting silence. "We found rifles waiting for us," he reported. The line did not disappear. It resisted. This was not what the German army had prepared for. For months, the Western Front had been locked in place. Attacks came and failed. Artillery thundered and gained nothing. Men died by the tens of thousands, for ground measured in yards. The gas was supposed to be different. It was supposed to break the deadlock. It was supposed to shock the enemy into collapse. And yet, here in the low fields and shattered villages east of Ypres, British troops were still in their trenches, fighting through burning lungs and streaming eyes, refusing to yield ground that logic said they could not possibly hold. The officer closed his notebook and slipped it back into his tunic. Tomorrow the attack would continue. More gas would be used. More pressure would be applied. Surely then the line would break. But a doubt had taken root. If British soldiers could endure this, if they could fight on after breathing a weapon designed to make survival impossible, then this war was not going to end the way anyone had imagined. In April 1915, German forces believed they were about to deliver a decisive blow at Ypres. Instead, they encountered something they had not planned for. Not a new weapon, not a new tactic, but an enemy that refused to vanish, even when the rules of war itself had been broken. And that realization would echo through German reports, diaries, and memories for the rest of the war. The Ypres salient existed because neither side had managed to destroy the other. On a map, it looked like a mistake, a bulge in the Allied line that pushed 5 miles into German-held territory, exposed on 3 sides and overlooked by higher ground. It was the kind of position staff officers usually tried to avoid, difficult to supply, hard to defend, and easy to attack from multiple directions. Yet by the spring of 1915, the salient was still there. Ypres itself was a small Belgian town, but what it guarded mattered far more than its size suggested. Roads and rail lines radiated west toward the Channel ports, Calais, Dunkirk, Boulogne. Those ports were Britain's lifeline. Every shell, every rifle, every ration used on the Western Front passed through them. If German forces broke through at Ypres and reached the coast, Britain's army in France could be cut off from its supplies. The war in the West might end quickly. That was why the salient had to be held. For 8 months, men had died to keep it from collapsing. The ground was churned into mud by shell fire and rain. Villages like Langemarck and Saint-Julien were reduced to names on maps and piles of brick and timber. Trees stood splintered and leafless, even in spring, their trunks snapped by artillery. Life in the trenches was a test of endurance more than courage. Water collected in the bottom of dugouts. Rats moved freely along the parapets. The smell of rot and unburied bodies never fully went away. Men slept in short bursts and lived with the constant expectation that the next shell might land on their section. The British line here was thin. Most of the pre-war professional army, the men who had fought at Mons and Le Cateau, had already been bled white. Replacements were arriving, but not fast enough. Units were holding stretches of trench longer than doctrine recommended, with little depth behind them. From the German perspective, the salient was an invitation. German forces held most of Belgium. They occupied higher ground around Ypres and looked down into the bulge from multiple directions. Artillery observers had clear views of British positions. Any Allied movement in daylight was quickly punished. German commanders believed that if the salient could be crushed, the rest would follow. The British would be forced to fall back toward the Channel. French forces would have to adjust their lines. The entire balance of the Western Front might shift, but previous attempts had failed. Shelling alone could not do it. Infantry assaults stalled in mud and wire. The defenders, battered as they were, clung to their trenches. So by April 1915, German planners searched for something that would finally tip the scales, something that would bypass trenches, wire, and morale all at once. They found their answer not in guns or numbers, but in chemistry, and they chose the Ypres salient as the place to use it. The men holding the line there, British infantry spread thin across an exposed arc of ground, had no idea that their sector had been selected as the proving ground for a weapon that would change warfare forever. To them, it was just another miserable stretch of front. To German headquarters, it was the place where the war might finally move again. The British soldiers holding the Ypres salient in April 1915 were not one single kind of army. They were a mixture: survivors, newcomers, professionals, and volunteers, stitched together by necessity and sent to hold ground that offered very little protection and no margin for error. Some of the men had been soldiers before the war. These were the regulars, remnants of Britain's small pre-1914 professional army. They had fought in the retreat from Mons, in the chaos of the early battles, and in the first brutal months of trench warfare. By now, many of the faces in these units were new, but the discipline remained. These men knew how to hold a line under pressure. Alongside them were the territorials, part-time soldiers in civilian life, clerks, railway workers, shopkeepers, men who had trained on weekends before the war and volunteered for overseas service when it came. They lacked the experience of the regulars, but not their determination, and increasingly, there were the volunteers of Kitchener's new army. They had answered Lord Kitchener's call in 1914, flooding recruiting offices in numbers no one had expected. By early 1915, Some of these battalions had reached the front sooner than planned, pushed forward by losses that had to be replaced. Many had only months of training behind them. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger before arriving in Belgium. What they shared was a uniform, a rifle, and an order to hold. Their standard weapon was the short-magazine Lee Enfield. It was rugged, fast-firing, and accurate in trained hands. British soldiers were taught to fire rapidly and deliberately, conserving ammunition while maintaining pressure. Even units new to the front drilled this skill endlessly. Machine guns were fewer, artillery support was limited, communications depended on telephone wires easily cut by shell fire or on runners crossing open ground under fire. There were no gas masks, no protective equipment of any kind, no manuals explaining what to do if the air itself became a weapon. The men lived packed into narrow trenches, shoulder to shoulder, with strangers who became comrades in days. They learned quickly how to tell incoming shells by sound, how to keep their heads down, how to function with almost no sleep. German intelligence described them as stretched thin, under strength, and vulnerable. That assessment was not entirely wrong, but it missed something important. The British troops in the salient were not positioned to advance. They were there to endure. They had been ordered to hold a line that mattered far beyond the muddy fields in front of them, and they understood that retreat was not simply a tactical decision. If they broke, the road to the Channel lay open, so they stayed where they were. And when the wind shifted and the first signs of something unfamiliar began to drift across no man's land, these men, regulars, territorials, and raw volunteers alike, had no idea they were about to become the first British soldiers to face a new kind of warfare. Across no man's land, the German soldiers looking toward the Ypres salient believed they understood what they were facing. Most of them were veterans. They had been under fire since the opening weeks of the war. Many had marched through Belgium in 1914, fought at Mons and along the Marne, and then dug in when movement became impossible. Others had been transferred from the Eastern Front, where distances were vast and casualties just as heavy. By April 1915, the German army on the Western Front was confident in its defensive skill and increasingly frustrated by the stalemate. They held the high ground around Ypres. Their trenches were generally better drained, better sighted, and supported by artillery positioned on firm ground. Observation posts gave them clear views into the salient. They could see British working parties, ration columns, and reliefs when the light was right. From their perspective, the enemy line looked strained. Reports described British units as understrength and exhausted. Replacements were arriving, but they appeared young and inexperienced. German officers referred to them as neue Leute, new men, still learning how to survive at the front. There was little respect. British troops were considered stubborn but unimaginative, good at defense, poor at attack, capable of holding trenches but unlikely to respond aggressively if shocked hard enough. The salient itself reinforced this belief. Any position protruding so far into enemy-held territory was, in German thinking, already a mistake waiting to be corrected. The question was not whether it could be crushed, but how much force it would take. German commanders believed they had found a way to reduce that cost. If the defenders could be driven out without the usual prolonged bombardment, without weeks of shelling and counter-battery fire, the breakthrough might come quickly. Speed mattered. Surprise mattered. The men in the front-line trenches were told only what they needed to know. Cylinders had been installed quietly. Special units had handled them. Ordinary infantry were instructed in the use of crude respirators made from cloth and gauze. The tone from above was confident. Once the gas was released, resistance would collapse. The British would retreat or die in place. The infantry would advance into empty trenches and push on before the enemy could recover. For the soldiers waiting in the German lines, this was not presented as an experiment. It was presented as a solution. What they did not yet understand was that their assumptions about the men in khaki, about how much pressure they could endure before breaking, were about to be tested in a way no army had ever experienced before. The weapon the Germans planned to use at Ypres was not loud. It did not explode. It did not tear earth apart or flatten buildings. It moved quietly, carried by the wind. Chlorine gas had been known to science for decades, but never employed on a battlefield like this. In its liquid form, it could be stored and transported. When released, it became a dense, yellow-green cloud that clung to the ground and crept forward at walking speed. It was heavier than air. That made it ideal for trench warfare. Once released, it would spill over parapets and sink into dugouts, foxholes, and low ground where men instinctively tried to hide. There would be no safe place below the surface. When inhaled, chlorine reacted violently with moisture in the eyes and lungs. Vision blurred almost instantly. The throat burned. The lungs filled with fluid as the body tried to protect itself. Men did not simply suffocate. They drowned, slowly, on dry land. The effect was terrifying even to those who understood it. German scientists had warned commanders that the gas was unpredictable. Everything depended on the wind. Too strong, and it would disperse too quickly. Too weak, and it might linger or drift back toward the German trenches. The soldiers who would follow the gas were issued primitive protection. Cloth pads, sometimes soaked in chemicals, sometimes not. They were told to keep them over their mouths and noses, and to advance quickly once the release began. Behind the German lines, more than 5,000 metal cylinders had been installed over a wide front. They were buried into the trench walls, angled toward the enemy. Inside them sat hundreds of tons of chlorine, waiting. This was not a battlefield improvisation. It was a carefully prepared operation, planned over months and approved at the highest levels. It also violated the laws of war. International agreements had banned the use of poison gas. But by the spring of 1915, those rules felt distant. The war had become one of survival and exhaustion. German commanders believed that if this weapon could end the stalemate, the moral cost was acceptable. For the men in the British trenches opposite them, there was no warning, no manuals, no protective gear, no understanding that the air itself was about to turn against them. All that stood between them and the gas was a shift in the wind, and on the afternoon of April 1915, that wind finally began to blow in the direction the Germans had been waiting for. On the afternoon of April 22, 1915, the Ypres salient looked almost peaceful. The sky was clear. The air was warm for the season. After weeks of rain and cold, spring had finally arrived in Flanders. Men stood on fire steps without greatcoats. Some worked on trench repairs. Others boiled tea or wrote short letters home, taking advantage of a rare calm. Along the German front, however, officers were watching the wind. Small flags and scraps of cloth had been tied to posts and rifle barrels. They fluttered steadily from east to west, toward the Allied lines. The breeze was light, consistent, and slow, exactly what the planners wanted. Shortly after 5 o'clock in the evening, the order was given. Along a broad stretch of the front, German soldiers turned valves on the metal cylinders embedded in their trenches. There was no explosion, no sudden noise to mark the moment. Instead, a low hissing sound spread down the line as compressed gas escaped into the open air. At first, the cloud seemed almost harmless. A thin, yellow-green mist rose from the German parapets and spilled forward, rolling low over the ground. It gathered in shell holes and shallow dips, thickening as more gas poured out behind it. From a distance, it looked like an unusual kind of fog, moving with purpose rather than drifting aimlessly. Men in the Allied trenches noticed it almost at once. Some pointed, others watched in silence, unsure what they were seeing. Fog was common on the Western Front, but this fog moved differently. It hugged the ground and advanced steadily, carried by the wind. Within minutes, the cloud stretched for miles. The first troops directly in its path were not British but French units, holding the line adjacent to the salient. As the gas reached their trenches, confusion turned to terror. Men began coughing violently, eyes burned. Breathing became painful, then impossible. Those who could still move climbed out of the trenches and ran. Within a quarter of an hour, entire sections of the French line collapsed. Thousands were dead, dying or fleeing to the rear, blinded and choking. A gap opened in the Allied front, wide, sudden, and completely unplanned. To the British units holding the salient, the danger became clear almost immediately. Runners arrived breathless with reports that the line to the left was gone. Officers climbed onto parapets and saw men streaming past, French soldiers in panic, faces burned and uniforms stained, coughing blood as they ran. And behind them, drifting steadily closer, came the cloud. The British left flank was now exposed. The trenches that should have anchored it were empty. If the Germans advanced quickly, they could roll up the line from the side and collapse the entire salient. There were no orders from higher command. Communications had already begun to fail. Telephone wires were cut or abandoned. Decisions would have to be made on the spot by officers who had never trained for this kind of situation. Some men wanted to fall back at once. Others froze, unsure of what they were facing. The smell reached them before the gas itself. It was sharp, like bleach mixed with metal. It burned the nose and throat even before the cloud arrived. Men covered their mouths instinctively. Some tried holding their breath. When the gas finally rolled into the British trenches, it did exactly what the German planners had intended. It sank down into the dugouts and low corners. It filled the firing bays. Men began coughing uncontrollably. Eyes streamed with tears. Breathing felt like drawing air through fire. Panic spread, but not everywhere. In some sections, officers forced men back onto the fire step. In others, non-commissioned officers took over when their superiors went down. Orders were shouted over coughing and confusion. The line bent, but it did not vanish. Behind the gas, German infantry began to move forward, advancing cautiously, expecting to find little more than bodies and abandoned rifles. Instead, they were walking into a front that was wounded, blinded, and choking, but still occupied. And the most dangerous moment of the battle had begun. When the chlorine gas rolled into the British trenches, there was no manual to consult and no equipment to fall back on. Gas warfare did not exist yet, at least not in any practical sense. There were no issued respirators, no drills, no standing orders. The men facing the cloud had never been warned that such a weapon might be used. Most had never even heard of chlorine outside of cleaning compounds or industrial work. Instinct took over. Some men tried to outrun the gas, climbing out of the trenches and moving to higher ground, only to find that the cloud followed them, sinking into every low place. Others pressed their faces into the earth, hoping the ground itself would offer protection. It did not. Breathing became agony. Every inhale burned the throat and chest. Men doubled over, retching, gasping for air that no longer helped them. In the middle of this chaos, a few officers and medical orderlies began to notice patterns. Men who had soaked cloths in water and held them over their mouths seemed to suffer slightly less. Those who urinated on rags, out of desperation rather than understanding, found that the sharpest effects were dulled. There was no time to question why. Orders spread quickly, passed from man to man along the trench. Wet your cloth, cover your mouth and nose. Stay low. It was crude. It was humiliating. It was the only thing available. Even with these measures, casualties mounted. Men vomited, collapsed, or clawed at their throats as if they could tear the pain out. Some went blind temporarily. Others lost consciousness where they stood. Still the line held. Non-commissioned officers played a critical role. Corporals and sergeants physically pushed men back into position when panic threatened to take over. Rifles were placed back on the parapet. Ammunition was distributed by hand because normal supply routes were breaking down. Every decision carried weight. If units pulled back too far, the Germans would pour through the gap created by the gas and roll up the flank. If they stayed, they risked being overwhelmed by both the weapon and the advancing infantry. In many sectors, junior officers chose the only option that gave them a chance. They stayed. The gas thinned as the evening wore on, but its effects lingered. Lungs burned. Vision remained blurred. Every breath reminded the men of what they had just survived, and of what might come again. Through the haze, movement appeared in front of the trenches. German infantry were advancing cautiously, rifles at the ready, moving in small groups. They expected little resistance. Their own orders assumed the defenders would be dead, dying, or in full retreat. British sentries raised their rifles. The first shots cracked across no man's land, slow and deliberate, not a wild fusillade, but controlled fire. Men aimed carefully, conserving ammunition they could not easily replace. German soldiers dropped. The advancing formations hesitated, then slowed. Officers tried to push their men forward, but the sight in front of them did not match the plan. The trenches ahead were not silent, they were alive. Behind the British line, runners were dispatched in every direction, carrying fragmented reports. The situation was unclear, but one thing was certain. The gas had not ended the fight. It had only changed it. And as darkness began to fall over the Ypres salient, both sides prepared for what came next, knowing that the worst moments of the battle were still ahead. Behind the drifting remnants of the gas cloud, German infantry began to move. They advanced cautiously at first, stepping over the parapet and spreading out across no man's land in loose formations. Officers had warned them not to rush. The gas, they were told, had already done the real work. What lay ahead should be little more than cleanup. The expectation was simple. The Allied trenches would be silent. The defenders would be dead, dying, or gone. Resistance, if it existed at all, would be scattered and weak. That was how the operation had been explained. As the Germans crossed the open ground, they saw bodies. French soldiers lying where the gas had overtaken them, some twisted, some still. The sight confirmed what they believed. The weapon worked. The line had broken. Then rifle fire cracked out. Not sporadic, not panicked, but steady, deliberate shots coming from trenches that were supposed to be empty. German soldiers dropped into shell holes or went prone instinctively. Officers raised binoculars trying to understand what they were seeing. Through the haze, they could make out figures along the parapets. Men in khaki, some with cloths tied around their faces, rifles resting calmly on the trench edge. This was not how a shattered line behaved. British fire began to take effect almost immediately. Men trained to shoot quickly and accurately at medium range now had clear targets advancing across open ground. The Lee Enfield's fast bolt allowed experienced riflemen to maintain a steady rate of fire, each shot aimed, each movement deliberate despite burning lungs and streaming eyes. German formations slowed. Units that should have pushed straight through began bunching up as men hesitated, unsure whether the gas was truly gone or whether another wave might drift back. Orders were shouted, repeated, lost. The battlefield was already becoming disorganized. German officers urged their men forward. They pointed toward the trenches, insisting that resistance could not last. But the reality on the ground was different. Every step closer brought heavier fire. Machine guns opened up in short bursts from British positions that had survived the gas. Their crews were half-blinded, coughing, and working with improvised protection. But they did not abandon their weapons. They fired until barrels overheated or ammunition ran low. The advance stalled in places where it should have flowed. Time mattered now. The success of the gas attack depended on speed. Any delay gave the defenders a chance to reorganize, to bring up reserves, to plug the gaps torn open by the initial shock. German doctrine emphasized momentum, but momentum was slipping away. Complicating matters, the gas itself refused to behave perfectly. In some areas, it lingered longer than expected, pooling in low ground and making movement hazardous even for German troops. In others, it thinned too quickly, leaving advancing infantry suddenly exposed to clear air and clear enemy fire. Communication between German units began to break down. Runners struggled to cross ground, now swept by rifle fire. Telephone lines had never been extended this far forward. Decisions had to be made locally, often by junior officers with incomplete information. Some units pushed on aggressively and paid for it. Others halted and waited for support that never came. The carefully planned wave began to fragment. As evening approached, the situation grew more complex. The gap created earlier in the Allied line still existed, but it was no longer an open door. British units on the flanks had bent inward, creating makeshift defensive angles. Men who had expected to be relieved or withdrawn were instead holding new positions under direct threat. German commanders faced an unexpected dilemma. They had inflicted enormous casualties. They had achieved surprise. They had opened the line, and yet they hadn't achieved decision. The enemy had not collapsed. The British had absorbed the shock, improvised, and continued to fight. What should have been a rapid exploitation was turning into another grinding engagement, exactly the kind of battle the gas attack was meant to avoid. As darkness crept over the battlefield, both sides dug in where they stood. The Germans consolidated what ground they had taken, uncertain how much resistance remained ahead. The British clung to what was left of their line, knowing that the night would decide whether the salient lived or died. The weapon that was supposed to end the battle in hours had instead dragged both armies into something worse, a fight at close quarters in failing light, with exhausted men on both sides, and no clear end in sight. Night fell slowly over the Ypres salient, and with it came a dangerous kind of uncertainty. The gas cloud thinned as temperatures dropped, but its presence was still felt everywhere. The air burned with every breath. Men coughed until their ribs ached. Eyes remained swollen and half-blind, making it difficult to tell where trench lines ended and open ground began. This was the moment German commanders had been waiting for. In theory, the enemy should now be incapable of organized resistance. Darkness, exhaustion, and the lingering effects of gas were supposed to finish what the weapon had started. If German infantry pushed forward decisively, the salient could still be split wide open before reserves arrived. But the British line, battered as it was, had not dissolved. Along the fractured edge of the salient, junior officers and senior non-commissioned officers began making decisions that would never appear cleanly on maps or in official orders. Telephone lines were useless. Written instructions arrived too late or not at all. Control devolved downward to men who could still stand and still shout. They understood one thing clearly. If they remained passive, the Germans would push through the open gap and turn the entire position from the flank. Holding was no longer enough. Something had to be done to disrupt the enemy's momentum. Small counterattacks began to form in the dark. They were not elegant. There was no artillery preparation and no coordinated timetable. Units gathered whoever they could. Men from different companies, sometimes different battalions, organized around the officers still on their feet. Bayonets were fixed, not because doctrine demanded it, but because ammunition was uncertain and visibility was poor. Close fighting was inevitable. The ground between the lines was a nightmare to cross at night. Shell holes filled with water swallowed boots and sometimes entire men. Barbed wire lay tangled and half-buried, invisible until it caught at uniforms and flesh. The smell of chlorine mixed with cordite and churned earth hung heavy in the air. German troops, expecting to resume their advance at dawn, were not fully prepared for what followed. British counterattacks erupted suddenly out of the darkness, aimed not at sweeping advances but at specific points, Forward positions, machine gun nests, small pockets of newly taken ground. The objective was simple: disrupt, confuse, and force the Germans to defend rather than advance. The fighting was brutal and intimate. Rifles were fired at muzzle distance. Bayonets were used not in sweeping charges, but in cramped trenches and shell holes where there was barely room to turn. Men grappled, struck, and fought with whatever they had in their hands. There was no clear sense of front or rear. Units became intermingled, commands were shouted and misunderstood. In some places, Germans and British occupied opposite sides of the same trench system, without realizing it until they were almost on top of each other. Casualties mounted quickly. British units already weakened by gas exposure suffered heavily. Men collapsed from exhaustion as much as from wounds. Yet the attacks continued, driven by the understanding that time was the most precious resource left. Every hour the line held increased the chances that reinforcements could arrive. Every delay forced on the Germans reduced the likelihood of a decisive breakthrough. By the early hours of the morning, the character of the battle had changed. German troops who had expected to advance found themselves digging in under pressure. Orders to push forward were met with reports of unexpected resistance, confused terrain, and mounting losses. The momentum of the attack had been broken. For the British, the cost was severe. Entire platoons were reduced to handfuls of men. Officers fell and were replaced by sergeants. Stretcher bearers worked continuously, often without being able to reach the wounded in forward positions. But when dawn approached, the salient was still intact, bent, scarred, thinner than before, but unbroken. As the first light crept over the shattered fields, German commanders surveyed a battlefield that looked nothing like their plans. The gas had opened the door, but the night had slammed it shut. What had been intended as a swift, decisive operation had turned into another grinding struggle, and now both sides understood that the battle for Ypres was far from over. The morning after the gas attack did not bring relief. It brought reality. As daylight spread across the Ypres salient, the full scale of what had happened became visible. Trenches were choked with abandoned equipment. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some in firing bays, others slumped against parapets. In low ground, the yellow-green stain of chlorine still clung to the earth, marking where the cloud had pooled and lingered. Men who had survived the night found it difficult to stand upright. Their lungs burned with every breath. Many could not stop coughing. Some spat blood into the mud at their feet. Others had lost their voices entirely and could only communicate with gestures. Eyes were swollen shut or half blind, forcing soldiers to squint through pain and tears just to stay oriented. And yet, the line still existed. It was thinner now, jagged, held by units that no longer resembled their original formations. Companies were reduced to platoons, platoons to sections. In many places, command rested with whoever was still capable of giving orders. German commanders did not intend to give the defenders time to recover. On April 23rd, the gas was released again. This time, there was no element of surprise. British troops recognized the signs almost immediately. The hiss, the rising cloud, the smell that reached them before the gas itself. But recognition did not equal protection. Improvised cloths were all they had, already stiff with dried chemicals and filth from the previous day. The second wave hit harder in some sectors than the first. Men who had already suffered lung damage now faced a new exposure. Some collapsed almost at once. Others fought on for hours, breathing through pain that felt like fire spreading inside their chests. German infantry followed close behind, attempting to force the issue while resistance was weakest. Attacks came in short, repeated pushes rather than a single massed assault. The intent was to find a point that would finally give way. In several places, British units were driven back a few hundred yards, but they did not rout. Withdrawals were conducted under fire, organized as best they could be, with rear guards holding until ammunition ran low. Machine guns were dragged back by hand. Wounded men were pulled from the line whenever possible, though many had to be left behind. The key fact remained unchanged. The Germans could not turn tactical success into operational collapse. Each advance ran into fresh resistance, sometimes from units that had only just arrived, sometimes from battered remnants refusing to move again. Reinforcements trickled in, not as intact formations, but as fragments fed directly into the line. For 72 hours, the fighting barely paused. Shelling continued day and night. Gas hung unpredictably in the air. Men slept in minutes-long snatches, if at all. Food and water became secondary to ammunition. The sound of artillery never fully stopped, becoming a constant background presence that pressed down on the mind. By the third day, exhaustion was visible on every face. Men shook uncontrollably from fatigue and chemical exposure. Some no longer reacted to nearby explosions. Others stared blankly ahead, functioning only because routine and discipline carried them forward. German forces, too, were feeling the strain. Their infantry had advanced into a battlefield that refused to stabilize. Gains were costly and fragile. Casualties mounted without the decisive breakthrough promised by the gas. Supplies struggled to keep pace with units operating in contaminated ground. What had been planned as a sharp blow was becoming another attritional struggle. By April 25th, Allied reinforcements finally began to arrive in strength. Fresh units moved into the shattered salient, relieving what was left of the original defenders. The line was shortened, reorganized, and finally stabilized. The crisis had passed. The cost had been enormous, but the outcome was undeniable. The Ypres salient still stood. German commanders had introduced a weapon that horrified the world and changed warfare forever, but it had failed to deliver the victory they needed. And among German troops who had fought through those 3 days, a quiet understanding began to take hold. British soldiers could be battered, they could be gassed, they could be pushed to the edge of physical collapse, but making them break was something else entirely. In the days and weeks after the fighting around Ypres, German officers began to do something unusual. They reassessed. The official reports that moved up the chain of command were careful in their language. They listed ground taken and lost, casualty figures, ammunition expenditure. They explained delays in neutral terms, weather, terrain, unexpected resistance. But in private writing, in letters and diaries, never meant for publication, the tone was different. German soldiers wrote about the gas working exactly as intended, and then failing to end the battle. One company officer noted that the British trenches had been cleared by the cloud, only to add, almost incredulously, that firing resumed less than an hour later. Another wrote that men advanced confidently behind the gas, certain that no one could still be alive, and were shocked to take accurate rifle fire at close range. Again and again the same theme appeared. The enemy had been expected to flee. Instead, he had stayed. A battalion report described British troops with cloths tied over their faces, eyes streaming, still maintaining fire discipline. The writer emphasized that this was not desperate, random shooting, but controlled fire that halted movement and forced units to ground. One junior officer recorded that his men hesitated after seeing this, unsure whether the gas had truly done its work or whether something had gone wrong. He admitted that confidence had evaporated faster than the chlorine cloud itself. Letters home echoed the same confusion. "We were told the English would be finished," one soldier wrote, "but they remained in their trenches and shot calmly. It was not what we were prepared for." Another described advancing through areas where French units had collapsed, only to encounter British resistance further along the line that seemed almost stubbornly deliberate. They did not attack wildly, he noted. They waited, then fired. This distinction mattered. German doctrine at the time relied on the idea that shock, artillery, surprise, new weapons could break morale quickly. The gas was meant to be the ultimate shock, something that no amount of discipline could withstand. Ypres challenged that assumption. German officers began to adjust their language when referring to British units. Early war stereotypes of slow, unimaginative defenders were quietly set aside. The enemy was now described as methodical, tenacious, and difficult to dislodge once established. One after-action summary concluded that while the gas had caused heavy casualties, its tactical exploitation was limited by continued resistance in sectors that should have been neutralized. That sentence said more than it intended. It admitted that something fundamental had gone wrong. Among frontline troops, the lesson spread informally. Stories circulated of British soldiers holding positions while half-blinded and coughing, of counterattacks launched when logic suggested retreat. These stories were repeated not as propaganda but as warnings. New arrivals were told not to assume that a British-held trench was weak simply because it had been hit hard. Respect replaced contempt. The gas attack at Ypres did not end the war. It did not even break the salient, but it forced a recalibration inside the German army, an understanding that British troops, once written off as exhausted and stretched thin, possessed a kind of resilience that could not be easily measured on a map. They could absorb punishment that should have broken them, and once that realization took hold, it stayed. From that point on, whenever German units identified British formations opposite them, planning changed. More artillery was requested, more reserves were kept close, assumptions of rapid collapse were avoided. The enemy had proven something, not brilliance, not invincibility, but endurance. And in a war that would grind on for years, endurance mattered as much as anything else. When the fighting around Ypres finally settled into a new, exhausted equilibrium, the battlefield looked unchanged at a distance. The salient was still there, the front lines still curved awkwardly